Hello. Actually, I'm going to do that intro again. My daughter is a 16-year-old, and she wants to start a skipping club at high school, which is not about skipping classes. It's actually about skipping from one place to another. So I'm going to skip on stage. I think she'd be really happy about this. In heels, mind you. All right. Thank you all for being here. I'm Amy. As Katie said, I get to work on some really cool stuff. I just wrote a book called, ooh, that's not my slide, let's try that. I just wrote a book called Getting Along. That is what I'm gonna talk about most today, but I'm also a contributing editor at Harvard Business Review and the co-host of the HBR's Women at Work podcast. If anyone listens to it, wants to talk to me about it, it's one of my favorite projects. But I want to talk to you about relationships. And I have a story I want to tell you from earlier in my career that I'm not super proud of. It was my second job. I was in my mid-20s. And there was a woman I really enjoyed working with. She's actually become a friend, which is interesting given the story. But she asked me one day, after we had like really good time working on this project together, she said, "Do you want to have like brunch this weekend or something?" And I looked her straight in the eye, no irony, just said, "I'm not here to make friends." I know that sounds really mean, and it was, but I actually believed it. For the very first part of my career, I was like, why would I make friends at work? I have friends. I have friends from college. I have my roommates. Why do I need friends at work? Now, I have come to learn, which something that many, many people already knew, and that decades and decades of research shows, which is that the quality of our life is dependent on the quality of our relationships. If you look at the Harvard Adult Development Study, which is one of the longest longitudinal studies that's been done about happiness, it shows for sure that our relationships matter. And that's true for our friendships, that's true for our relationships in the community, with our neighbors, with our family, but that's also true of our relationships with our coworkers. It's in those relationships that we find the emotional sustenance to thrive. How many people know who Vivek Murthy is? So Vivek, not many of you. Vivek's actually spoken here. I should call him Dr. Murthy, actually. So Dr. Murthy is the Surgeon General of the US. He was the Surgeon General under Obama. He came back under Biden, which is wonderful. He's a wonderful person. He wrote a book about loneliness called Togetherness. And he really, really lays out the case for why we need connections. Now, let's be honest. Most of our relationships at work are probably good, but occasionally we have to work with some difficult people. And maybe in your head you imagine those difficult people look like some of these monsters here. It's totally understandable if you feel like you work with some monsters. In fact, a recent study showed that 80% of people said they worked with a terrible coworker. And 83%, not surprisingly, said it affected the quality of their work. Now, just show of hands, how many people would say they're working with someone who they find terrible right now? That's a lot of you. I love the cheering. Yes, I work with someone terrible. Amazing. I want you to ask yourself, so maybe you don't work with someone terrible now. Congratulations to those of you who did not raise your hands. But you've worked with someone in the past who you found terrible, I'm guessing. And I want you to ask yourself what it was like to work with that person, or what it's currently like to work with that person. What happens in your body when you have to think about them, send them a Slack message, be in a meeting with them, have to have a conversation with them? How does it feel? And if you could choose one word to describe how it feels, what would that one word be? You can just shout it out. Anxious, horrible, draining, stressful, what else? Nasty, panic. Oh my gosh, these are good words. I notice none of you are like joyous, excited, like my best self. Right? Of course, that's understandable. No one wants to work with someone terrible, and the impact of that negative interaction, of working with someone who we find terrible or uncivil, who mistreats us. Maybe they demean us. Maybe they undermine us. Maybe they're just a pain. Maybe they're just annoying. Has serious consequences. You know, a lot of people, I actually work at Harvard Business Review, as I mentioned, a lot of my fellow editors love things like strategy, operations, supply chain, like the real, what we call hard stuff in business. And I really like to focus on what we call the soft stuff. And I think a lot of my fellow editors think of the soft stuff as sort of the icing on the cake. Like, yeah, relationships are good. They help us do the really hard strategy. To me, that's the cake. How we interact with one another is how we get work done. You can have the smartest minds in the room. You can have the best strategy. You can have people who are just so good at operations. Whether or not they succeed will depend on the quality of their interactions. So this is not the icing. This is the cake. Now, when you're dealing with someone who you find terrible or you find difficult, you might think, well, I've been dealing with people my whole life. I know what to do. I'm just going to follow my brain's instincts. I'm just going to do what my body tells me to do in that moment. Now, there's two problems with that. Our brains actually don't work with us in these moments. And let me tell you a story. Again, as an editor at HBR, I get a lot of people who were interested in contributing articles. And it means I'm dealing with tons and tons of emails every day, requests from people who have really great ideas. And unfortunately, I don't have time to give every single one of them. And there was someone, let's call him Brad, who had submitted an article and wanted to follow up. And I said, Brad, I emailed him, I said, Brad, we're gonna get to you. I promise, we're gonna review your piece, I'll get back to you. He said, could we just hop on the phone? I said, I'm so sorry, I wish I had time. And to be fair, it was a particularly busy time. Sometimes I will hop on the phone, but it just was really busy. And he didn't like that answer, and he came back, he said, no, let's just hop on the phone. Can we have a half-hour call? And I said, I just can't, I'm sorry. And he wrote this email back that said, human connection is the most important thing. I can't handle the ego. I will take my writing elsewhere. You're very quiet. Does anyone think that was like a fair email? Like, you know, yeah. I mean, and to be fair, he wanted something. I get it. He was being assertive. But I can tell you word for word what that email said because of the negativity bias. It's the same reason I can tell you a line from my performance review in 2001, which that said I didn't have business acumen, by the way. Right? But I can't tell you all the positive things that were in the review. I can't tell you about the other probably 150 neutral or positive emails I got the day I got that email from Brad. And our brains are so focused on protecting ourselves, on sensing, looking for threat, that it hangs on the negative. So when you have a difficult interaction with someone, it's immediately focused on the worst case scenario. And then because of a psychological concept called premature cognitive commitment, which is basically the story you tell yourself, right? So immediately in my head, Brad is a jerk. I am just doing my job. Why is he raining on my parade? Right? And then the story starts to evolve in, what if Brad's right? Do I not care about human connection? So, and I'm slowly gathering, because of confirmation bias, evidence to prove that Brad is a jerk and I am right. Right? That is what we want. When we're in a difficult situation, we want to feel okay. Our brain senses for that threat. So because of this negativity bias and because of the stories we tell ourselves, we get really stuck. And I noticed no one actually, maybe some of you, I didn't hear all the words you were shouting about, but none of you mentioned that feeling of being stuck. Like you can't actually get out of the situation with this person. And that's really how I feel when I'm trying to deal with someone who's pushing my buttons, right? I feel really stuck. And what we need are tools and tactics and frameworks that help us get unstuck. And that's what I want to share with you today. So to get unstuck, let's first talk about what our goal is. Number one, our goal is stronger relationships. We want to be connected with our colleagues, not just because it feels good, but because it's good for the work. In fact, there is tons and tons of research about the positive benefits of having friends at work. I think back to my 25-year-old self looking my friend Gretchen in the eye and saying, I'm not here to make friends, and boy, was I wrong. And in fact, the ironic thing about that statement is that I made friends in every work context I've been in since, right? We have to have those friendships. There's a study done by a group of researchers at Rutgers that showed that people who said they had a best friend at work actually had higher performance ratings, right? So this isn't, again, about feeling good. This is about the work that we actually do. And it is better when we have friends, when we feel connected. Now, of course, your difficult colleague is not going to turn into your BFF overnight. In fact, I would posit they're probably never going to turn into your BFF. I've heard it occasionally happen. But you want to have at least a neutral relationship with them. And this is where the second goal comes in, which is you want to develop interpersonal resilience. And this is the feeling that when you are in a challenging situation, when you have that colleague who pushes your buttons, that you feel more confident interacting with them. You feel less of the stuckness, less of the anxiety, less of the frustration, and you feel like, I can handle this. And when you are deep in those interactions, you feel less stress as a result, right? That's really what you want to develop. Now, not all terrible coworkers are created equally. And one of the reasons I wrote my book, Getting Along, was that because a lot of the advice that was out there, including in my first book, which is the HBR Guide to Dealing with Conflict, is very generic. What are the tools and frameworks you need to deal with anyone who you're having conflict with or who you're disagreeing with? And that is useful. But what I knew from my work is that there were specific tactics, specific tools that you could use depending on the pattern of behavior that you're dealing with. So how you would deal with a pessimistic colleague would be very different from how you deal with a passive-aggressive colleague. Of course, there are principles that apply in all those situations, but you can also use specific tactics to try to neutralize that behavior, to try to shift the dynamic with the other person. And that's why I came up with 8 archetypes. These are the patterns of behavior that we regularly see when dealing with someone we find difficult. So just show of hands, how many people, when they saw this list, were like, oh yeah, I saw my coworker there, immediately knew that they were dealing with someone on this list? That's most of you. Okay, how many people looking at this list are thinking, oh, that's me? I only saw 2 hands, and I don't believe that. I'm gonna ask a question. How many people look at this list and think, oh, that's me? Yeah. I will tell you, when I wrote this book, the original chapters, these archetype chapters, had a section, if this is you. And the manuscript was way too long. And my editor and I were discussing, what do we cut? And he proposed cutting those what if this is you chapters, or sections. And I was really hesitant about doing it. But our discussion was like, oh, people aren't gonna have the self-awareness to think they're the pessimist, or they're passive-aggressive, or they're the insecure boss. The book came out September 13th. By 9 p.m. on September 13th, I had no less than 15 LinkedIn messages, emails, and Instagram messages telling me, I realized I am this person. And I think I hugely underestimated the self-awareness that people have, that they fall into one of these categories. And I share that. I know you came here to learn how to not deal with yourself, but deal with other people. But I share that because I think you have to have the empathy to understand good people fall into these categories. None of us is above being passive-aggressive, playing the victim, playing some office politics. All right? So rather than using these archetypes as labels that distance yourself from the other person, think of them as diagnostics. You have to figure out what is the behavior that you're dealing with in order to take steps to address it. What are the patterns that you see in your colleague that are problematic for you? And how do you address those? And when you do, when you notice that you're dealing with something that you think is passive-aggressive behavior, or maybe someone who's behaving in a biased way, you then have to ask yourself a very important question before you proceed, which is my perception of their behavior laden with bias? Because it is very easy to look at someone who's doing something differently than you, right? Who is pushing your buttons, who's doing something you think might be inappropriate, and quickly slap a label on them without recognizing the way that bias plays a role. And I will tell you, when Brad sent that email, I've never met Brad, I never saw a picture of Brad, I knew nothing, I had a little bio of Brad. But when he sent that email, I was like, typical white man. So arrogant, right? We have to watch for the bias. When people don't behave the same way as us, they don't think the same way as us, they don't speak the same way as us, we quickly want to label that as difficult. Our brains like to sort things into easy categories, but you have to watch out for that. The other way we need to beware of bias is that the workplace, and I'm sure this comes as no surprise to all of you, the workplace doesn't work the same way for everyone. So in terms of what's available to us, let's take passive-aggressive behavior, for example. Some people are allowed to say exactly what they think. They don't have to caveat it. They don't have to sort of hide it under sort of a series of exclamation points in an email, right? They can just say what they mean. Other people, maybe who don't have access to traditional power, who might be penalized for being assertive, they might resort to passive aggression because it's the only way to get their point across in that context. So make sure you're questioning whether bias is playing a role in your perception of their behavior and the archetype that you're landing on. Now, once you do decide, okay, I am dealing with the pessimist person, or I am dealing with the political operator or the tormentor, the thing you do not want to do is go right to that person and say, by the way, I figured it out. You're the tormentor, and here's what we're gonna do. In fact, you never utter this label to the other person. It is not helpful, right? This is meant to be a self-diagnostic, right? So you can figure out what you're dealing with, and then you ask yourself a series of questions. Because there's a lot of this behavior, right? Political operating, know-it-all, pessimistic behavior, that is annoying. That's really irritating. But it's not necessarily problematic, right? Your know-it-all colleague occasionally saying, well, in my last job, right, referring to the incredibly illustrious tech company he used to work for, right? That's annoying, but is it problematic? The know-it-all behavior, for example, becomes problematic when they interrupt, when they cut you off, when they proclaim things that just aren't true. I'm a know-it-all, by the way, so all those things I've done probably in the last week. But you have to figure out what is actually problematic about the behavior. What's the behavior you want to address? Then you want to think, what is a rational explanation for that behavior? Not because you're trying to excuse their behavior, not because you're trying to justify it, but because once you have a little bit of empathy, you have that realization, right, none of us are above these patterns of behavior, then you're going to be in a much better frame of mind to collaborate to solve it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. You also have to ask yourself, what role might I be playing? With a passive-aggressive colleague, have you made it clear you don't like to be disagreed with? So they're trying to find ways to show you they have a difference of opinion through their behavior, through their eye rolling, through their snarky comments, none of which is fun, but it may be that you're encouraging it. Do you have a culture of toxic positivity? So your pessimist feels like they constantly have to poke holes because people are missing huge, important risks in the work. And then you ask yourself, okay, what tactics should I try? How am I going to try to address this behavior? All right, let's see what that looks like with two of these archetypes. We'll start with the insecure boss. I'm assuming no one in here identifies as an insecure boss, so we're good, right? First question is, What behavior is problematic? It is absolutely normal to feel insecure. In fact, I would posit that everyone in this room has felt insecure today. Maybe it was about your outfit, maybe it was about what session to go to, maybe it was about, oh, did I catch up on those emails? Like, am I doing the right thing? I have the self-doubt. Those who do not experience any insecurity or any self-doubt, then we have a label for those people, and they're psychopaths. Truly. So think about that when you're dealing with their boss, and you're thinking, well, I don't like that they're not sure of themselves. I wish they were more confident. I wish they were more decisive. Just remember that we all feel insecure. And there's interesting research that actually shows the higher up in an organization a leader gets, the more insecure they feel. Because the gap between what the expectations are for them and their actual skills tends to get broader. So you might assume, why does my boss feel insecure? They have the title, they have the salary, they have the authority, right? But oftentimes bosses feel insecure. So what's the problematic behavior? Perhaps they're micromanaging. Perhaps they're hoarding information. Perhaps they're preventing you from interacting with people who you need to interact with to do your job. Those are the behaviors you want to address. Now, what might explain it? Again, we all feel insecure at times. And especially as a boss, you might be more prone to feeling that. And how might you be playing a role? Is it possible that you signal to your boss that you are a threat, that you don't trust them, that you're out for their job? Maybe you have not done that explicitly, but maybe you've done that implicitly. Then the question is, what tactics do you want to try? Now, you might think this is a strange tactic, but if you think about the fact that insecurity is often fed by threat, this is a tactic that Lindy Greer, who's a professor at University of Michigan, gave me when I interviewed her for the book. She studies a lot about conflict, what makes a great team, what makes a great leader. And I asked her, have you ever dealt with an insecure boss? And she said, oh yeah. And I said, what worked? She goes, well, I had a coach at the time, and the coach told me to imagine myself as a cute, fluffy squirrel. I was like, okay, that's a little strange. Tell me more. And she explained that her and her coach figured out that her boss was probably feeling really threatened by Lindy. Lindy's a superstar, right? And so when Lindy interacted with her boss, she never said, I'm a cute, fluffy squirrel. Please don't do that. People will be very confused. But she imagined herself as a cute, fluffy squirrel, not to undermine her authority or her superstarness, but just to soften her edges in her own mind. And she found it worked. Right? So think about, how do I make sure that my boss sees me as an ally? Right? Now, here's another piece of advice I don't love to give, but the research on this is clear, that one of the things that helps an insecure manager is some well-placed compliments. Now, if you're sitting there going, ew, I am not going to do that, you have my complete sympathy, and you don't have to do it. But I will tell you, the research makes it very clear, by telling your boss what they're good at, what you admire about them, they will feel a little less threatened. It will calm some of that ego defensiveness. Now, if they are horribly indecisive, don't go, by the way, you're so decisive. I love the way you make decisions. It has to be a genuine compliment. And I think this is true in every aspect of your life. Please don't make fake compliments, but especially true with the boss who feels insecure, because they will be looking out for moments of untruth. So you really have to be sincere. And lastly, again, some really wonderful research that shows with abusive supervision, which I think the insecure boss often falls in, but in abusive supervision is what we refer to it in the academic literature, can be shifted if you can prove to your boss that they actually need you. They need your expertise, they need your guidance. You have a piece of information or a skill that no one else on the team has. And that can alter the balance of power between you and your boss so that they are much kinder to you as a result. All right, let's talk about the pessimist. The pessimist is actually one of the archetypes I've been hearing a lot about lately. I think partly with what's going on in the economy, partly in general how people are feeling. about work, about the world, there are more and more people who are concerned and expressing doubt and negativity. It's frustrating though, right? So let's think about, okay, what's the behavior that's problematic? Someone saying, oh, I think things aren't gonna work out, right? Not necessarily problematic in and of itself. But if they shut down the conversation, if they make you question whether or make the team question whether the project's gonna succeed over and over, if they take an outsized role on the team with that negativity, that is problematic. So what would explain it? What would explain some pessimism? Now, for some people, it's simply anxiety. Some people, it's an outlook on life. They either were brought up with it or they learned it over time. And again, pessimism in itself isn't necessarily bad. Who among us hasn't looked at something and been like, wow, that is not gonna work, or oh, that's gonna go terribly. We've all done that. So again, it's not problematic in and of itself unless it's having consequences on the work, right? Unless it's having consequences on the team and the culture. So what role might you be playing? Let me just tell you, pessimists think optimists are idiots. So if you go to a pessimist and say, I don't know why you think the world is so horrible. It's actually a wonderful place. And I don't know why you think this project is gonna fail. It's totally gonna succeed. We're gonna exceed our targets, right? The pessimist is sitting there going, you're a moron. So you have to really watch out for that polarization, and you have to watch out that you're not encouraging the pessimism by insisting on optimism, insisting on positivity. And that's the very first tactic you want to try, which is to watch out that when they're like, no, it won't work, you don't go, yeah, well, right? Because then you're in a tug of war. Where do you have to go? So make sure that you're not insisting on positivity. You also can give them a role to play. And I actually love to call this, some people call this devil's advocate, I like to call it the disagreeer in chief. And give them a formal role to play. So, because instead of what happens, and again, there's interesting research that shows this, and a team dynamic when everyone's sort of coalescing around an idea or an innovation or a strategy, and then one person speaks up. And it's counterintuitive or contrarian or slightly cynical, we give that person a ton of power. And while it's important that we make sure we point out what the risks are, we have to be sure we don't get dragged into the pessimist viewpoint, right? That's the real risk, is that the pessimist ends up gaining power. And oftentimes, that's why people will resort to pessimism, because they feel powerless. So if you give them a role to play, you can right-size their perspective. That contrarian perspective, the risks they're pointing out, give them that role. And at a specific designated time in your meeting, you turn to them and go, all right, you are awesome at pointing out risks. What are we missing? And how do we mitigate them? And that's the last part. You want to grant them their premise. Again, if you say, no, the world's great, puppies and rainbows, they're going to think you're a moron. So instead, grant them their premise. Say, I see how you believe that. Part of me actually believes that too. There's a small part of me that sees what you're saying. But what if we did X, Y, and Z? Or how can we mitigate those risks that you're pointing out? Because those are important risks. So give them a sense of agency so that they believe there's something to do about it. There's 6 more archetypes. If we had 4 hours, anyone want to stay in this room for 4 hours? We can just talk them through it all. But I do want to share some of the more general principles that you need for getting along with anyone. So perhaps your colleague doesn't fit into any of these categories, or maybe they fit into all 8. I'm so sorry if that's the case. But there are some principles. I really think of these as the touchstones to go back to whenever I'm struggling with someone who I find difficult. Number 1 is to remember your perspective is one perspective. Your colleague has another perspective, your boss probably has another, your direct reports have another, someone outside the situation will have another. There's a concept in social psychology called naive realism, which is that, I'm looking at this slide and I'm like, that's blue and yellow. If one of you told me, nope, that's red and green, I would be like, whoa, they're wrong, right? We believe we're seeing things so clearly. And when someone sees something differently, we just assume they're misinformed, they've made the wrong assumptions, they're just wrong. One of the best studies, this is one of my favorite studies in this area, looks at what happens when you ask people to tap out the rhythm of a well-known song. So like, take Happy Birthday, right? So they ask the people tapping out the song, how often will someone listening to the taps know that you're tapping out Happy Birthday? And they guess about 50% of the time, which seems fair, right? Like 50%, half the time someone will know. In reality, does anyone want to guess what the percentage is that the listeners guess the right song? Anyone? 5, you're all too high, 2.5%. Because think about it, I'm sitting there tapping out Happy Birthday. Like, I hear it in my head, the taps are totally aligning with the rhythm, right? All they hear is just this random set of taps. It could be any song, because they don't have the narrative in their head. And think about that. When I'm sitting there dealing with my difficult colleague, I have that story I'm telling myself, right? I did this, they did this, then they sent that snarky email, and then I replied very politely, and I tried to escalate, but it didn't work, right? You have that whole story, and they have the whole separate story. So try to remember that you're only seeing one perspective. And one of the most important questions you can ask yourself when dealing with this person is, what if I'm wrong? Not because you necessarily are, but because it will expand your thinking and how to approach this person. The second principle I want you to remember is to not make it you versus them. In the same way you don't want pessimist versus optimist. Oh, I'm passive aggressive, or they're passive. I am passive aggressive sometimes, but they're passive aggressive, I'm straightforward. Right? You don't want to get into that me versus them. You want to see yourselves on the same side of the table. So rather than there being two entities in this relationship, you and your colleague, there's 3. There's you and your colleague on the same side of the table, trying to solve the problem together. And the problem might be this quarter's budget shortfall. It might be the project plan you need to get done. It might be the way you interact. But if you see yourselves as trying to solve that together, even though they may insist on getting up and going to the other side of the table, but if you insist in your mind over and over that we are in this together, again, you're going to be in a much better mindset to try to solve that problem, try to neutralize the relationship, to try to shift them into more productive behavior. Now, the third principle is to avoid gossip mostly. Now, how many people would say they've gossiped about something at work in the last week? I don't believe you, those who are not raising their hand. We do it all the time. And the research on gossip is clear. It has so many upsides. We feel bonded with the other person. When you and I agree that Michael in finance is annoying, it feels really good, right? You and I feel closer. We now are like, oh, Michael, oh, right? And if we find out another person in another department also thinks Michael's annoying, oh my gosh, right? Now we've got a little posse, the Michael is annoying group. We totally are together. And that bond is real. Research has proven that, but that bond is real. The other upside of gossip is that it allows us to get information. Oftentimes the gossip isn't about Michael, but it's about, well, what's going on with the company? Have you heard anything about our finances? Do you know how that partnership we were going after is going? Did we get that? Did we sell to that big client? That is important information. You need to do your job. Now, there's also a huge downside to gossip, especially when you're talking about dealing with difficult people. As soon as Michael hears that there's the anti-Michael club, right? Now Michael's really going to dig into a lot of negative behavior. Also, the research shows that when you gossip about someone else, it reflects most poorly on you. So no matter how clear you are about how the many ways Michael is terrible, those colleagues who you're bonding with are still in their head going, Amy's a bit of a gossiper. Like, could she be talking behind my back too? So we want to make sure that we're not feeding into the conversation bias, right? So let's say Michael in finance is annoying because he's a know-it-all. right? As soon as me and my colleague gossip about that, and we see Michael as a know-it-all, now everything Michael does, we're like, did you see that? Totally know-it-all, totally know-it-all, right? That confirmation bias. So you want to stay away from that negative gossip that feeds into the confirmation bias that reflects poorly on you. Now, I'm not gonna tell you you can't gossip ever, because let's be honest, it's gonna happen, right? But you really wanna keep it as constructive or as neutral as possible. The last principle I'll share is that you wanna experiment to find what works. If you pick up a book and it says, here are the 5 steps to dealing with your passive-aggressive colleague, if you do these 5 steps, everything will be fixed. Do not believe that for a moment. These are not processes in which there is a clear, order of things you can do, and you can be sure that things will get better. In fact, humans are messy. The context matters. The culture of your team, the culture of the organization, the culture in which you work, all of that is going to influence what you can do and what is successful. So instead, you choose a few tactics. Like I said, if you don't want to flatter your insecure boss, fine, don't do it. But choose a few other tactics that you're going to experiment with and put on your scientist mindset and think about, what can I learn from trying this out, right? And try one tactic. Take note, did it work in private? Did it work in public? How, did it work when the person was well-fed and rested, right? Or did it not work at all because it was the end of the day and they were stressed out? And one of the most tricky things is you'll find a tactic that works, let's say that gets your pessimistic colleague to be more constructive, and it'll work and you're like, yes, I am a master of dealing with difficult people. And then 3 months later, that tactic stops working. Super frustrating. So you have to continually refresh your tactics, continually learn what works, what doesn't. So I want to just sort of recap these principles. I know people like to have a slide with all of it on it. We are that squirrel with a fanny pack. And all of this you practice over and over to develop that muscle and to develop that interpersonal resilience. It is through the mistakes we make, because you will make mistakes, that we learn to be better, that we try harder, that we feel more resilient. Like, oh yeah, I've been in this one before and I didn't do it right, but I'm gonna try again, right? Trying again, that's how we learn. Now, I'm gonna leave you with a 3-part mission. And these are the things, we're not done yet though, so don't worry. But these are the things I want you to do. Remember that study I showed at the very beginning that said 80% of people said they have a terrible coworker? 93% of people in that same survey said that most of their relationships were good. Because of our negativity bias, we get really fixated on that one colleague or those 2 colleagues, or maybe you have 3. But chances are you have really positive relationships at work as well. Those are the people you want to spend time with. Those are the relationships you want to invest in. And of course, you want to address the problematic behavior with the challenging group, but don't let all of your mental energy go there. You also want to be comfortable disagreeing, dissenting, debating. We have this syndrome that seems to be happening in most organizations that Patrick Lencioni, the author of 5 Dysfunctions of Teams, calls artificial harmony. And that's this belief we act as if we get along. We smile, we nod, we're like, yeah, totally. And then we turn around and roll our eyes. Or we find our friend to gossip about what happened. Right? We act as if we get along because we are afraid of disagreement. But that's what I want you to do, is to disagree, dissent, debate. And lastly, I want you to have self-compassion. As I said, you are going to mess up. It is not always going to go well. You're going to say things you regret. You're going to say things you wish you could take back. You're going to wish you could start all over again, and that's okay. I talk about this topic day in and day out, and my teenage daughter still looks at me at least once a week and says, "You're not following your own advice." And she's right, because it's hard to do. And that's I have to challenge you all, as you're looking at all of this and you're thinking, yeah, okay, yeah, that makes sense. How many of you are like, man, but I'm not gonna do that? It's just so much more fun to be mad at my colleague, right? To focus on my friends, really not worry about those people. Because let's be honest, all those words you described about how you feel, frustrated, anxious, stuck, when your brain is in those modes, you're not going to be in your best behavior. And behavior change is hard. So instead, I want you to figure out why. Why is this important to you? And I'm going to share, this is actually my daughter. As I mentioned, she's now 16, but this picture was taken in 2010 in Union Square. There was an art exhibit that, it does look like it's photoshopped in, but I swear that little stand is not photoshopped in. This was an art exhibit by Miranda July. How many people know who Miranda July is? Wonderful artist. And it was called 11 Heavy Things. And my daughter was 3. As I mentioned, she's 16 now. But I want to share with you my why. Why do I do this work? And I'm going to read it because it's really hard for me to say without crying. I do this work for my daughter with the deep wish that she will have the courage and strength to set boundaries, to say no, to advocate for herself. The times in my life when I didn't say no because I was powerless or afraid or worried about hurting someone's feelings or being unkind or overstepping bounds were some of the most painful moments in my life. They still haunt me today. We don't always know how to disagree. And this causes problems not only in crucial life-changing moments, but in small ways every day. I've spent my career watching people look for agreement. We all want affirmation, the nods, the, oh, I totally agree, the we're on the same page. The danger of this isn't just that we don't leave room for healthy conflict. It's that difference in itself then becomes problematic. Seeking agreement makes us want to work and spend time with people who see things the exact same way. But I've come to learn that no doesn't have to be angry, rude, or unkind. No is not the opposite of kindness. In fact, saying no is the kind thing to do in many situations. And it's not the opposite of love either. Setting boundaries can be a loving thing to do. When you do it thoughtfully, it creates space for the other person, a safe space where they can explore their ideas, form their own opinions, and be themselves. I want us to embrace conflict as part of love, as part of what we do when we care about one another. Often we disagree, sometimes we fight, and as long as we do it with respect and compassion, with the intention of understanding one another and learning, it's a good thing. I want this girl to think differently about conflict and disagreement than I did, to embrace those things. I want that for her, and I want that for all of us. I want us to all feel comfortable voicing disagreements. I want us to know we can push back when we or others are being treated unfairly. I want us to create spaces where difference is understood and embraced. I want us to have connection, not sameness. I want us to strive for understanding, not just affirmation. That's my why. She's my why. What's yours? Thank you. All right, we're gonna do questions. I have to tell you, Esther Perel had the best part in the Q&A where she said, by the way, I'm answering these questions very confidently, but I'm really just sort of talking out loud. So I want you to know I will answer your questions confidently, but I can't be 100% sure. All right, so here's the first one. What if everything you've tried still doesn't work? When do you know it's time to give up on the relationship? Yes, so chances are you are gonna try a lot of things and they won't work. And you have to decide for yourself when is too much. And I wanna make this clear, first and foremost, your health, your well-being, your physical and mental health is incredibly important. You prioritize that. You should not be engaging in these difficult relationships in a way that harms you. And if you notice that those boundaries are being violated, then you need to take some different steps, right? You're not giving flattery to a boss who is completely undermining and dehumanizing you. So prioritize yourself first, right? A lot of what I talk about is about having empathy for others. First, have empathy for yourself, and then you can think about others. What explains that behavior? Now, it's not gonna be a clear answer. I can't tell you, you try 3 months, and if it doesn't work, you quit. All right, you have to try several things, see what you learn, what doesn't, but set some boundaries for yourself, right? I'm gonna try these tactics for 2 months. If it doesn't work, I'm gonna start brushing up my resume. All right, or I'm gonna try these things for 6 months. If this person doesn't leave, which oftentimes does happen, right? Or if this person doesn't leave, or if our relationship doesn't change, then I'm gonna move on and try something else. And I wish I could tell you this is the point at which you're done, but you really just have to try a variety of different things. Okay, anonymous, what can I do as a third person? Should I mediate, create discussion? So if you're a manager, I get asked this question a lot. Like, what if I'm a manager and I have 2 people on my team who really aren't getting along? What do I do? The nice thing is that all of the tactics that I shared can also be used as coaching tools. And whether you have authority over those folks because they're your direct reports, or you're simply a third person who is invested in them getting along, you can individually, or as a threesome with that group, or the pair that's not getting along, you can coach them through some of this, right? Like, I know there's more than one perspective here. What's your perspective? What's yours? Right? Just encourage them to try to get out of the story they're telling themselves, get fixated on that negativity bias, and get them to see the situation differently. All right, another anonymous question. I'm not surprised these are anonymous. How do I cope with someone who has proven themselves untrustworthy, is addicted to office gossip, and also inaccessible as it pertains to their job function? All right. I'm sorry for whoever submitted that question. That does not sound fun at all. I do think that you have to also set boundaries, clear boundaries around people who you really truly feel cannot be reformed. I will say my first question about this person is, what are they gaining from this behavior, right? What are they gaining? Do they think they're gaining power? Do they think they're gaining respect from others because of this behavior? And is there a way you can help them gain those same things through more productive behavior? Now, that may be totally beyond your capability to actually make happen, but I would ask yourself, is there something that they're actually getting that they could get another way? At the same time, you need to clearly set boundaries. And what I mean by that is interact with them as little as possible. There's a concept called job crafting, right? If you can actually craft your job in a way that minimizes the amount of interaction you have to have with them, fantastic. I would also make sure that you are setting mental boundaries for yourself around how much time you think about them. That email I mentioned about from Brad, I will tell you, I thought about that email for like 3 months straight. It was not an appropriate amount of time to spend thinking about Brad. So I suggest you set a timer. Like, set a timer on your phone. I have 15 minutes to think everything I want to think about this person. And then when it's done, I move on. And you can have 15 minutes tomorrow, too. I heard someone call this hippo time, where you actually get to wallow in your feelings. All right? Let yourself do that, but then move on. Because you don't want that to infect the way you interact with them, the way you interact with others, the way you do your job. And I will also suggest, especially for someone who sounds like they might be really challenging, is to document what's going on. Because at some point, you may need to escalate that situation. You may need to defend yourself if this situation erupts. So document not just what they did when it happened, who was there, but also what you did in response. Because if you need to make an appeal to higher ups, you want to show that you have taken productive approaches to trying to address the situation. Okay, another anonymous question. How do you work with difficult people without feeling like you're playing a game or being someone you're not? I love this question, right? I share in the book a lot of tactics you can try, sample language. I am not gonna guarantee that it's gonna feel authentic to you, that you're gonna read one of those phrases and it's like, oh, I can just say that, right? It is really a challenge to find a moment or a way to interact with these people, to exercise some of these approaches and tools without feeling like we're faking it, right? I actually had once someone said, how do I say all that without it sounding like I read your book and I'm just trying to do the right thing? And part of it is you have to sort of practice, you have to develop this muscle, and sometimes it will come off like you just read a book and you're trying out something new. But as far as I understand, and certainly in my experience, people don't really penalize others for trying really hard to make the relationship better. So it may feel inauthentic at times, and that's absolutely understandable, but keep trying, right? Keep trying to find a way that it feels comfortable to you. And I think over time, that gap between what you are trying to do and what you actually feel will get a lot smaller. Okay, another anonymous question. Did anyone enter their name, by the way? Why should we have to make all the effort to be the adult in the room if it's the other person causing the problems in the first place? Just show of hands, how many people actually were like, yep, I thought that. Like, why do I have to do all this work? I totally understand. I'll tell you why I think we should be the adult in the room. Partly because it's the only thing we can control. I wish I could tell you that you could hand a prescription for therapy to your colleague, or that you could insist that they change, but you cannot. And you can't control the way they react, you can't control their behavior, and even if you're their boss, you cannot make that happen. So think about what you actually can control, and it's your own thoughts, reactions, and behaviors. And as frustrating as that may be, it is one of the most sort of truisms of interacting with difficult people, is that you really want to focus on what you can control. Now, here's the thing. If you do not care about that person, if they're not material to your job, if they're not actually causing you a lot of stress, you don't have to do anything differently. But if you really want things to be better, and I hope I've made the argument clear here why we want to have, at minimum, a neutral relationship, but positive relationships with our coworkers, then it does require that we be the adult in the room. And sometimes it requires we be the adult in the room while they continue to tantrum, while they continue to do things that are really frustrating, that are really unfair. But I have to say, me personally, when I've had to deal with these folks, when I've really, really sort of said, okay, I'm gonna be the bigger person here, I have felt proud of that. And yes, at times I'm like, oh, this is so frustrating. But I've also been really proud that I lived with my values. So I think that's why we have to take these steps. Karen has a question. She shared her name. Thank you, Karen. How do we ensure the archetypes don't feed into or foster additional bias? What are checks and balances leaders need to embrace? Excellent question. I do think we want to make sure, I talked about how to make sure you're checking your bias before you start even putting people into these categories. And I think that's really important to do at that initial stage, but it's something you continually do. When you're choosing how do I interact with them, what tactics am I going to use, when you're deciding is this working or not, you are always asking yourself, what role does bias play here? There's actually a great trick, an HR executive named Kristen Pressner. She has a wonderful TEDx talk, I recommend you check it out, where she talked about her own internalized sexism and how she found herself really judging fellow female executives. And she introduced a tactic that I think is really useful that's called flip it to test it. So when you decide someone is a know-it-all, or you decide someone is the tormentor, or is playing the victim, ask yourself if that person was from a different identity, different race, different gender, different ability, would I think the same thing? Now, you won't always see that 100% clearly, but even asking the question, make sure that you're checking your bias along the way. And I think you have to constantly remind yourself, what are my biases, right? Where do I make snap judgments? And how can I be sure that I'm not doing that in my interactions with these colleagues? Okay, we can take one more question. I'm gonna try to take one. Oh, here we go. Okay, Ram, this is a good question. How can we get to know our blind spots? Am I an insecure boss, for example? I don't know, Ram, I hope not. But it would be normal if you were. I do think that, again, I was so surprised at this reaction to the book, how many people said, oh, that's me, right? I had one friend said, I just bought 7 copies of your book to give to all my team so they can figure out how to deal with me. Right. Which I was like, thank you for buying 7 copies of the book, but that's not the solution. And what is the solution is if you have an inkling, like Ram, I'm guessing you are thinking, maybe I'm the insecure boss. If you have an inkling, trust that. And that doesn't mean you decide, okay, this is who I am, but that means you take steps to get honest feedback. Do not go to your friend who is like, no, you're perfect, don't worry. Go to the friend who will tell you like it is and ask them for honest feedback. I have a sense that I might be micromanaging my team out of a distrust. Do you see that happen? Or can you watch me for a week and tell me, am I interrupting people in meetings? Am I falling into that know-it-all category? Right? Really get the feedback you need. And if that's you, have some empathy. We've all done this. We've all been there. And behavior change is hard, so start small. And I would use the same 4 questions I introduced before, which is, what is the behavior that's problematic? Right? Really take a look at what is that behavior? What would be a rational explanation? Why might I be doing this? Right? What role are others playing? How is this feeding in? How is the culture of the team feeding in? And then what very specific tools or tactics do I want to try to change? All right, we are out of time, but you have been wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope to see you all at the book signing. Thank you.